Hi, everybody. This lecture will be on chapter 7 and cover learning. I'm not sure we'll get through all of it in one recording. I'll probably break it up, but let's begin. So, when you think about the content of the course so far, we started out with basically chapter 1, what is psychology? Chapter 2 focused on the brain and the neural mechanisms of behavior, then talked about sensation and perception. We've discussed memory. So, we're really thinking how all of these um, ideas behind what is psychology and the biological basis of behavior really is just that. It's the biology of behavior and how our brain, through synaptic connections, form networks that allow us to process information that we remember. And part of remembering, the memory piece, is learning. So we'll pick up here now with learning. We'll cover what is it? What's classical conditioning? Operant conditioning. While they both share conditioning in title, it's about shaping behavior in similar but different ways. We'll probably pick up the next lecture, though, on observational learning, implicit learning, and then learning in the classroom. So, a good place to start is what is learning? And you're all aware that your learning is based on your experiences. Really think about the things that you've done, what you've participated in. Learning produces changes in us through our experiences. Think of the evolutionary significance of memory, and in particular, of learning about things in our environment. Before we even really discuss the content, think about some of the stuff we've learned in general about different species. What about bright colors? What comes to mind about brightly colored species? And the common element is stay away from them. Not good. At the basic core of what learning is, it's the acquisition from our experience of new knowledge, skills, or responses that result in a relatively permanent change in the state of the learner. Think about what this implies. As many of you listen to this lecture, it won't be in a classroom. But when you think about the classroom itself, what do you notice is pretty consistent through every experience every day? It's that you all come in, you sit down, and you listen. It's quiet. You all come in, sit, and listen. I don't have to ask you to do it. You just do it. That's that permanent change in your behavior that's occurred through years of shaping you through reinforcement to sit down, be a good listener with your ears and not your mouth, and to pay attention. All of that work your teachers have instilled in you has led to where we are today, where you've learned something about particular environments where we expect ourselves to behave in a particular manner. But think about also how artificial that classroom is. Is that really normal for you to sit and just listen? No. In other contexts, you would probably talk and not just sit still and pay attention because I want you to. A very sort of simple, non-associative learning form to begin with is habituation. Now, we know learning's based on experiences, and sometimes these experiences can produce a change in our behavior. But habituation is that through repeated exposure or to prolonged exposure to stimuli, it will result in the gradual reduction in responding. Now, that might sound pretty muddy when you think about it, but have you ever got up and put on deodorant or cologne? Of course you have, or perfume, it doesn't matter. And what you'll notice is that when you first put it on, you can smell it, and I'm sure you enjoy it. But then you'll get ready for the other activities you want to do throughout the day, and you'll notice that not too much longer later, maybe you drive into the university, you sit in a classroom, you don't notice the smell anymore. And maybe a friend's like, "Oh wow, like that smells nice." And you're like, "Thanks. I can't notice it." What about if you're cooking food? Have you ever walked into a house where someone's preparing a meal for you and you're like, "Oh, that smells amazing. Can't wait to eat this." And you ask them, "How's it smell to you?" While your experience is this is great because it's your sort of initial exposure to the smells in a room, the person preparing it has been smelling it all along. meaning the prolonged exposure to these stimuli results in a decline or a decrease in the, say, noticeability of the smells in the room when you're producing food, cooking food. We'll also think about sensitization as well, which is a simple form of learning that occurs when the presentation of a stimulus will lead to an increased response to a later stimulus. So we're not trying to desensitize ourselves to things. We want to increase the response to behavior. These terms become important, but it's really more about the shaping of the behavior to achieve desirable outcomes. That's really important for learning in general. Now, the basic principles of classical conditioning can be a little bit technically challenging, for lack of a better word. But classical conditioning is when a neutral stimulus produces a response after being paired with a stimulus that naturally produces a response. So again, when a neutral stimulus, something that doesn't elicit a response or behavior, gets paired with something, and now what we'll see is a change in your behavior as a result of the pairing of this naturally produced response to some neutral stimulus to begin with. And don't worry, there's going to be an example in a second to explain this so it'll make sense to you. The term itself, uh, maybe just so it's clear, if the experiment we're going to talk about, Pavlov's famous one, was with salivation in dogs. He's measuring how much saliva is produced by dogs, different stimuli. And you can imagine if you ring a bell, the bell is not on its own the first time going to elicit some kind of physiological response. Why would it? But over repeated pairings of the bell and then the food coming shortly thereafter, the dog learns, hey, there's food. So eventually the bell, that neutral stimulus, will produce a natural response to salivation once it hears the doorbell, despite the food maybe not necessarily being present right away. So the terms we want to think about are unconditioned stimulus, which is something that reliably produces a naturally occurring reaction in an organism. So it's unconditioned, it's naturally occurring. So think about food. I don't know what time of day you'll be listening to this, but even just imagining food can create that desire to want to eat it. And you can almost imagine like a sour candy. Your mouth starts to water. So that salivation is something we could measure in dogs, which Pavlov did. And we can see this unconditioned response. So the food, the unconditioned stimulus, results in the unconditioned response that naturally occurs through the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. So seeing food causes salivation. Now, the conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that is initially neutral, like a doorbell, and it produces a reliable response in an organism once it's trained to detect it. And the conditioned response is a reaction that resembles the unconditioned response, but is produced by a conditioned stimulus. So they're kind of fancy terms to say, we know that we can, if you've ever had an animal, we can train an animal to do things that we want it to do. And that sometimes we'll get them to do things like modify their behavior when we play a tone. So on a shock collar, you don't have to shock them. You can actually play a tone with it. Or conversely, you can use a dog whistle. But we're trying to find something that indicates to them that a change of behavior is required or about to happen. So I know these terms are new. You may need to rewind and play this over or refer to the book, but I mean, by all means, pause here. But we'll explain what this is as we get to it just momentarily. So in this experiment, Pavlov initially was recording, he's a physiologist, not a psychologist, and he's recording how much saliva is produced in dogs to various stimuli. And typically what happened, I just want to make sure I didn't miss something in the previous slide. No. So what was interesting in this initial observation was that some of the cool experiments in psych were able to determine neat things by dumb luck, for lack of a better description. So what happened was Pavlov was doing his research out of his house, and this is in Russia. And he had someone, an assistant, a graduate student, come and meet him at the house to feed the dog. So because he's working in the basement, you would ring the doorbell to alert him that you're there and just come on in and go downstairs and feed the dog. So someone comes, rings the doorbell, enters the house. The dog can hear the footsteps, on the ceiling above them. The person comes in the basement, feeds the dog. Then this recurs over several days. And it doesn't take the dog long to learn a similar time of day. A doorbell rings, door comes in, footsteps across the ceiling. All of these are cues indicating I'm about to get fed. Excuse me. So, as a consequence, the dog then hears the doorbell and then there's saliva produced. And Pavlov, fortunately, who was studying saliva, was able to detect an increased production and attribute it to the bell. The dog must have learned by association that the bell implies it's going to be fed. So now that the bell on its own sounding off would cause the dog to produce saliva. So it was really a remarkable, study, or at least observation to determine this. And he did subsequent and many studies afterwards demonstrating that this could not only happen, it could happen in even more complex ways. So typically the unconditioned stimulus has a unconditioned response. The stimulus results in the response of salivation. He then decided to pair a neutral stimulus, a metronome. If you've ever played music, piano, guitar, doesn't matter. You can often play with a metronome, which random tip is really good for timing purposes. The response would have been nothing. The dog wouldn't know that the metronome meant anything on the initial exposure. So over time, during acquisition, through learning or training, what we do is we present the metronome with food. So the conditioned stimulus that does nothing is paired with something that's rewarding, the unconditioned stimulus, and the response is the dog food. Over time, what you'll get is the metronome will be played, and then the dog will naturally start to produce a conditioned response. The dog has learned through conditioning to respond, produce saliva in the presence of the metronome. If this has worked successfully, and the metronome now elicits physiological response we can measure, now you can pair the metronome with a black square. And at first, the black square wouldn't do anything on its own, but presented with the metronome, the dog will produce saliva. And eventually, through second order conditioning, now the black square will end up being able to then also produce saliva. So shaping and training or modifying behavior, or really what we're saying, learning, was really fascinating. And this was occurring in the early 1900s. But the fact that we were able to shape behavior in desirable ways was revolutionary. And in terms of psychology, this became extremely famous. So, how do we really come to learn? Now we'll discuss acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. Some of these things will recur throughout the lecture, so just bear that in mind. We might discuss things multiple times. Acquisition, by definition, is the phase of classical conditioning when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are presented together. So we have to acquire something. So if we know that a dog sees food and starts drooling, we're going to have to figure out a way to elicit the presentation of this, pairing it with something else to elicit a response. Once this is acquired, so if we come back to here, initially the unconditioned stimulus, that's going to produce the unconditioned response. But to get a conditioned response, it has to be paired with something. So food is a really effective motivator to get multiple animals to act in ways that wouldn't necessarily be typical, but we can train them to do things like not just simply respond to a metronome. You'll see later on, we can train animals to peck at a screen, to differentiate between Monet and Picasso, so they can discriminate artwork. It's quite amazing what we'll get to, but simply put, we know that we can pair these different stimuli to naturally occurring behavior and elicit a new response. But imagine your parents are trying to motivate you to clean your room. And remember birthdays when you were younger? The best part of birthdays was opening cards. And what'd you get in your cards? You got money. It makes you feel good. Now imagine your parents are like, you made the mess in the room, go clean it up. Asking you to do it may not be enough of a motivator to do so, but they might say, I'll give you $20 if you go clean your room. So the money can become a reinforcer to go and clean the room. Or maybe it's praise and you go clean your room. And then it's like, great job. I'm really proud of you for doing that. So there's lots of ways we can try to encourage behavior to continue. So the acquisition, it's really trying to demonstrate that we know we can do things, and we're trying to encourage the way of continually producing behavior that will be desirable. This is really more terms for operant conditioning, but we'll continue here with classical conditioning. So the acquisition is simply taking naturally occurring behavior and pairing it with something else to try to get this conditioned response. Extinction occurs when we present stimuli. So let's go back to Pavlov. Imagine now you ring the doorbell, you come in, you get food. The dog knows and learns this relatively easily. But what would happen if, say, the mailman came to the door and rang the doorbell, and the milkman comes to the door and rings the doorbell, and your neighbor comes over, rings the doorbell to see what you're up to? Every time the doorbell gets rung and the dog doesn't get fed, can result in a change in the amount of saliva produced to the point where if the doorbell just keeps getting rung and it's really busy, say it's a weekend, and you're not feeding the dog every time this occurs, then you've eliminated the response to it. So now this unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented, the food, and as a result, the behavior will change. It can be eliminated. We described the second order conditioning a moment ago. That's when we take something now, the conditioned stimulus, that's paired with another neutral stimulus to then become associated with this. So the unconditioned stimulus similarly is done in earlier procedures, but now elicit a response. So like the black square would be the secondary order conditioning. Money is another great second order conditioner as well, but you can read about that in the textbook. So we know that behavior can go away if we don't reinforce it. So imagine your parents are giving you money to clean your room, and you're like, okay, and every time you clean the room, they're giving you money. And then you clean your room and they don't give you money. And then you do it again and they don't. And you do it again and they don't. How much longer would you wait to stop cleaning your room? This could be true for any other chore, like sweeping the floor, doing the dishes. If you are always given an incentive to do so and then it's taken away, how likely are people to still going to do the thing that you like done, that you find desirable in the absence of rewarding it? Spontaneous recovery is a tendency of a learned behavior to recover from extinction after a rest period. So if the doorbell's being rung, the dog's not being fed, the dog's behavior, the amount of saliva produced, will change. But then one day, Monday comes, the doorbell rings, the student comes in, feeds the dog then learns, yay, doorbell means food again. So that's where behavior, even though it may change through extinction, can spontaneously occur. But then if you start ringing the doorbell and not feeding them again, you'll also get extinction that can follow subsequent to this. So this figure from your textbook demonstrates acquisition, the learning part of a experiment, as well as the extinction that occurs when you remove the stimulus. So in this case, it was drops of saliva elicited by the conditioned stimulus. And through extinction, so you can see basically the number of trials to pair the bell with the food to elicit saliva. And now you can see without the bell, we can get um, a pretty consistent response in the saliva produced in the dog. And then we're going to take that away and look how quickly the behavior changes over the course of trials. So if you're not being rewarded for doing it, the animal won't be motivated to do it. Now, you might see on the next day, 24 hours later, this spontaneous recovery of behavior where they'll start producing saliva when they hear the doorbell, but it also fades away pretty quickly, similarly to the second spontaneous recovery 48 hours later or 24 hours after the first rest. Um, while there's a slight recovery, the response falls off very, very quickly. So think if you're training your animal and trying to get it to do something desirable that you want, and you don't reward it. Is it going to learn the basic commands you're trying to teach it? No. So food's a strong motivator, but the goal is to do it with the food and then to ultimately do it without it so that the dogs just listen or do the things that you want. Well, let's say you're doing your training and you run out of food and the dog's not being motivated through food to do the things you want. You could see how it might regress, if you will, and just stop listening, because what's the incentive to do so? That's similar to the extinction part that we see here. I mentioned, and you can refer to this in the book, that second order conditioning, while we know now what it is, money can be one of these very highly or motivated rewards to get us to modify our behavior. And the thrill of spending it on things to make us feel good makes it a very desirable second order conditioning um, stimulus. So part of learning as well is being able to take the results of a study and then generalize it to other things. So typically we want to generalize our study from our sample to a population. And this is something that'll make more sense when you take statistics. But if we come back to thinking in this context of learning, generalization would be a consistent response, even though the stimuli, the conditioned stimulus, is slightly different from the original one. It's almost like saying when the phone rings, you would elicit saliva production similarly than when the doorbell rings. Now, generalization in the one hand, in the next slide will help make this crystal clear as to the response generalizing to other things. It's also important that we know through learning we can discriminate amongst similar stimuli as well. So we have the capacity to distinguish between similar but distinct stimuli. And what we've learned from this Watson 1920, it's Watson and Reiner, is a famous study in psychology where the infant you see here, baby Albert, is 9 months old. His mother's a nurse who works in the hospital where Watson works. And what they did is they took out a white rat and put the white rat out on the ground where a little Albert could see it. And then I think it was, took a hammer and struck a steel bar with it, making a very loud noise, like taking two pots and bashing them together. What this did was elicited a startle response in little Albert. So he sees the white rat, then there's this large, loud bang on the steel bar, and he starts to cry. And they do this over and over. And I know how this sounds. You have to remember there are no ethics in this period of time. Nevertheless, little Albert is being paired with a white rat and a loud noise that causes him to cry. And then eventually, what do you think happens when they put the white rat out on the ground? If you guessed he started crying without the loud bang, then you're correct. But that should make sense based on how classical conditioning works. The question is, what do you think would happen if a white rat was replaced with a white bunny rabbit? If you guessed that he cried, you would be correct. Little Albert generalized from a white rat to the white bunny rabbit, and he would start crying. Similarly, you can see here he's wearing a white mask, and he would cry in response to that. I think one of the I think Santa Claus came to visit the hospital, and little Albert was brought in, and he started crying when he saw the white beard on Santa Claus. So he's generalizing that white things are fearful. So the purpose of this experiment was to demonstrate that we could, well, Watson, associate a fear stimulus, if you will, the banging on a pipe, to elicit a particular response, the fear response of a white rat, which you could then generalize to other objects that were white as well. So fear and anxiety were produced through classical conditioning. I know that this, it sounds pretty uh, I know it's pretty difficult to hear something like this done to a 9-month old. And you might be wondering, what were the repercussions of this? Um, Unfortunately, we don't know. Little Albert passed away at, I think it was 7 years of age. So we don't really know the long-term consequences of this. Um, there really wasn't anything reported. Part of the other problem, you might well wonder, how is it not reported? Well, Watson, although he's going to become extremely famous, and this study launches him into the stratosphere, which we'll be discussing operant conditioning shortly. So Pavlov's in Russia, classical conditioning is discovered, and he becomes really famous, especially within Russia's circle. The military's hiring him. They're trying to train pigeons to deliver bombs. Like really anything you can imagine about shaping behavior to do things, that's what's going on. Conversely, at the same time, Watson is also trying to think about how we can shape behavior, but to sort of ruin where the rest of it goes rather quickly, behaviorism, as it's discussed here, is no longer supported. And as a consequence of that, and just a few decades later, the evidence and the ideas of behaviorism, because they're not supported, resulted in Watson leaving academia and publishing research. And he went to create a really brilliant marketing career, to use this to shape behavior for different businesses, kind of like Mad Men. But the problem in doing that is he destroyed all of his documents. He burned them all. So there's nothing left to know what he did because he's destroyed the records of his life's work. Is this controversial? Yes. Is it ethical? I mean, it'd be difficult to get this passed today, given what you're trying to do and the unknown of what's the consequence of the startle response to the baby. My wagering, I guess, would be it could persist, but it could also fade away depending on, again, you could just extinguish the behaviors, and it'd be it'd be challenging to do this with people today. I don't think it would get approved, to be honest, but I do know you could do this with animals, and there has been considerable research with animals, and that's where kind of the majority of the behaviorism research will go. So while those things are happening in different parts of the world at the same time, Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner in 1972 were really thinking about the cognitive elements of classical conditioning. We know you're learning, but what's going on? What are they really thinking about? And Bob Rescorla especially has become extremely influential in modeling behavior, to help explain learning and the weight and strengths of learnings and or of stimuli and learning. That really challenges the way we think about the acquisition of information. So they were the first to theorize that classical conditioning occurs when an animal has learned to set up an expectation. So we don't really know what animals think, but we have to assume they're expecting something. And introducing a cognitive component that accounted for a variety of classical conditioning phenomena that were difficult to understand from simplest behavior point of views really helped to understand how sophisticated classical conditioning was, but also adding a significant cognitive element to this equation. So, your expectation in classical conditioning is you're going to feed me. You want me to do something to get food, so I'm motivated to do it. And we know that with people, we can motivate people to do all sorts of things. In animals, it's no different. We just motivate you by keeping you at about 80% of your ideal body weight. How do we know this? When you bring in rats, for example, you say put some aside. They're your control rats. They can eat and drink, and basically their job is just to live. And you can measure their weights, and then you get 80% of that weight, and that's where you'll keep the other rats so that they're motivated, they're hungry to perform the experiments we ask them to perform. In the Rescorla-Wagner model of classical conditioning, a conditioned stimulus serves to set up an expectation, and this expectation in turn leads to an array of behaviors that are associated with the presentation of a conditioned stimulus. So the tone, the bell, the metronome, the expectation is you're going to feed me, which can result in a multitude of behaviors like salivation, tail wagging, looking for food, begging, amongst a host of other things. There's also research using eye blink, puffs of air on the eyes, typically done in rabbits, that suggests that classical conditioning draws upon implicit, so unconscious, not explicit or conscious memory. So the awareness of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. A natural response in rats is to freeze. And you can look at the evidence of delay and trace conditioning of people with amnesia, as well as impaired reality testing with people who have schizophrenia, demonstrate that implicit memory really in classical conditioning is what we're working with and not necessarily explicit memory. The experiments in the eye blink conditioning implicate cerebellum in the delay trace conditioning. The hippocampus is also implicated in trace conditioning, but not as much as in delay conditioning. And the amygdala, the central nucleus, is responsible for fear conditioning, so behavioral and physiological, really the autonomic nervous system responses. So, the central nucleus of the amygdala plays a role in producing both of these outcomes through two distinct connections with other parts of the brain. And if the connections linking the amygdala to the midbrain are disrupted, the rat does not exhibit the behavioral freezing response anymore. So they won't startle and freeze, they'll just keep going about their business. And if the connections between the amygdala and the hypothalamus are severed, though, the autonomic responses associated with fear cease, meaning they no longer exhibit fear. So we know these are two separate, distinct pathways that relate to learning. What's the evolutionary elements then of classical conditioning? Basically, adaptive behaviors allow us to survive. Think how important it is that we all act and follow the rules accordingly. Think about what we will tolerate in terms of behavior and what we won't tolerate. But let's be more specific. Let's think about taste aversions. Have you ever ate something and it just didn't sit right, meaning you feel sick, you're nauseous, and then you throw up? What's happened is you've paired the association of illness with the food you just ate, thinking that must have made me sick. These taste aversions occur rapidly and only in a few trials. In fact, in rats, it'll occur in one trial. You see, rats are neophobic, which is a fancy way to say they're scared of new things. They're scared because if they eat something and they get sick, a rat cannot vomit. It lacks the sphincter to do so. As a result, the rat will gape or open and close its mouth successively, almost like yawning, but it's just opening and closing its mouth, indicating it's not feeling well. When other rats see this, they will go and smell the breath of the rat that's gaping, that's sick, and they will avoid what that rat ate or what they consumed. So that's really a neat behavior of rats. And you can demonstrate how powerful taste aversions are, especially in them. But we know ourselves how we feel about the foods that have made us ill. There's not a strong desire to consume them. For me, it's vodka. Me and vodka didn't get along once, and I have no desire to consume it ever again. We also see different perceptual qualities like smell or taste, not necessarily just the act of ingestion itself. Some people smell something they don't like, and it can be paired with sickness as well. And it's more often the case with novel foods than less novel foods. So that's sort of an evolutionary advantage of taste aversions because they help keep us safe. We don't want to ingest things that make us feel sick. Now, what about people who have cancer? And you might be thinking, well, what's this particularly about? One of the challenges when you have cancer is that you go to the hospital to receive treatment, typically chemotherapy and radiation. Now, the chemotherapy that's given to patients, it can make them sick. And what happens is they've received treatment, then they go home and they get sick. And they pair the sickness with the hospital. And it can become so challenging for these patients that when they drive towards the hospital and get near it, they start to feel sick. How would we stop this? You can imagine how challenging it is because you have to go to the hospital for treatment, but now they're getting sick, physically getting sick just by looking at the building. You guessed using marijuana, you would be correct. Research has shown that you can use marijuana and it does help to reduce the sensation or feeling of nausea and breaking that association of nausea with the hospital for chemotherapy in cancer patients. So it's pretty neat how we can find ways to overcome these feelings to allow people to still receive the treatment and care they need and to get better, hopefully. The biological preparedness is the propensity for learning particular kinds of associations over others. And you can think about the things that are really important to us that allow us to more easily acquire um, whatever it is we're trying to learn. So, under certain conditions, people may develop taste aversions. The serving of hummus in the image above looks inviting. It probably tastes delicious. There's at least one psychologist who avoids all hummus like the plague. Likely they ate it and got sick. My professor in graduate school ate a hamburger and got sick. And, he's smart. He knows that the burger isn't the cause of him getting sick, but that reaction is so strong that he couldn't break that pairing of feeling sick when thinking about a burger, even though he knows the burger didn't actually make him sick. That's essentially the reaction he has. So most researchers agree that conditioning works best with biologically relevant stimuli to an organism, which is why with animals, we try to motivate them using food. Now, what about real world problems? In the real world, it's not uncommon to think that people overdose. In fact, Sault Ste. Marie, if you're based out of here, I believe has the highest incidence of opioid use per capita in Ontario, which is not a very positive statistic. I know for injections, for crack, for intravenous use of crack cocaine, the highest rate is in London, Ontario. My friend's an emergency physician there. We've talked about this in the past. The fact is, drug overdoses occur and they occur worldwide. They've increased substantially during the past decade, and in fact, decades. Why people use drugs is a great question if that's what you were thinking. Why do people use them? And the sad reality is people will use drugs for lots of reasons. And I don't know that's an easy question to answer, but we do know that people overdose. And a different question could be why? What's contributing to individuals' reasons as to why they overdose? And Shep Siegel was asked to help do this. I think it was in 1974 because there was an increase in the number of opioid users using heroin who are dying of overdose. And while people may use drugs, we can assume they're using drugs to, like I said, for lots of reasons. Let's just assume you're doing it to numb the pain of something you're experiencing, but they're not using, I think we can agree, as an attempt to take their lives. They're using it to numb something, not to necessarily harm themselves or to kill themselves. So what's going on that's resulting in an increased use of opioid deaths, overdose? And you might be saying, oh, well, it's fentanyl, added to the drug. This wasn't the case in the 1970s. The surprising findings was it was the location that the users were using drugs that contributed to their overdose. Because when you're using a drug, you know that over time they're going to develop tolerance. And part of that tolerance is how their brain learns and through neurotransmitters secreted about the environment of where they are when they use the drug. So basically, your brain creates this protective physiological response, which becomes part of that conditioned response. Like all conditioned responses, it occurs in the presence of a conditioned stimulus. So, really, this is before the drug is administered. You can see how there's a decrease, if you will, in the physiological responses or increase of neurotransmitters secreted that result in, we'll just call it tolerance. So, it's a compensatory response because of where they're going to use the drugs that result in tolerance. So, you need more drugs to have the same effect. Taking drugs in a new environment can be fatal for a long-time drug user because the addicts are doing so, but taking the drug, the amount of drug they needed yesterday to get high in a novel setting where they've never used heroin before. Now, the conditioned stimulus is altered such that the physiological compensatory conditioned response that usually has a protective function does not. And as a consequence, the drugs have an increased effect, resulting in an overdose and quite often deaths. What Shep Siegel did was actually genius. He took a group of white mice and he had them inject morphine or saline into their pouch, to their tummy areas, and he put them on a hot surface and he measured how long would it take them to lick their paws, so paw licking latency. What he found was that the group that used heroin was significantly slower to respond, as you would expect, because morphine is dulling the pain. Now, if you're wondering why didn't they use heroin, the answer is because it's illegal. You can't use that. You certainly couldn't use people either. You can't risk harming people. But we could use morphine, which is heroin's cousin. They're still in the same family of drug. So what he did is he basically developed tolerance with these mice by giving them the same amount of drug in the same location, and over time, their response, their paw licking latency, decreased, meaning they need more drug to have a longer paw licking latency, or to have the ability to overcome tolerance, which they did. So over time now, they've increased the amount of drug used to elicit a similar behavioral response. And then what they did is they changed rooms and injected the groups with the same drugs they needed to overcome tolerance yesterday. And you'll never guess what happened. They overdosed, demonstrating that it was the location in which drugs were being administered that had a significant impact on behavior. That's just an example of how conditioning can help explain the paradox of fatal heroin overdose, which is very complicated, but also really clever and designed to help understand why it occurs and what we might be able to do to overcome it. So if you knew a friend who was, abusing drugs and they were going to go somewhere new to use them, you would probably be best to say, use less because the new environment might change the effect of the drugs on your behavior. I know it's hard to imagine what that must be like, but have you ever gone to a nice restaurant and had dinner? Have you ever been to a friend's house where they've given you a glass of wine and you think this is really good? I distinctly remember being at my uncle's house, and for the record, very well off. And we're there. I was in graduate school visiting, and his brothers were there. And he's giving them wine. And you have to understand, he has bottles of wine that are very expensive, thousands of dollars a bottle. So in their minds, they're drinking really good wine and they're thanking him. This is very kind and generous of you to share this with us. And he's laughing. My uncle thought it was hilarious. And they're like, why are you laughing? It's not funny. We're being very serious. And he's like, the wine you're drinking is $14.95 at the LCBO. What's even funnier is that even though we had this expectation that it was going to be good, How do you think it tastes if you went and bought it after that event and drank it in your home? And if you guessed not as good as it did there, you'd be correct. It's like going out to dinner. The ambience of the environment we're in, the anticipation of a good meal. Think of how that affects what we expect to occur versus what does occur. And if we change the conditions, we can change our perception of the experience. Somewhat similar to how conditioning in this instance is described. Operant conditioning. So we'll shift away from classical conditioning a little bit to operant conditioning. And we're going to start with Edward Thorndike. Thorndike focused on puzzle boxes to show the law of effect, which states that behaviors are followed by a satisfying state of affairs. They tend to be repeated. If you do something and you like the outcome of it, like praise, good job, I'm very proud of you, you're more likely to do it again than if you're told, why did you do that? You suck. You're less likely to repeat behaviors that are not desired by somebody else. In this instance, we'll talk about puzzle boxes you use with cats and other animals. But the type of learning we're talking about now is called operant conditioning, where the consequences really of an organism's behavior will determine if it will be repeated or not in the future. So what Thorndike liked to do is to create these puzzle boxes where the cat has to find a way out of the box to get the reward, meaning the food's there. It's there on every trial, if you will. You have to figure out, how do I get out? Now, if you look at that box, what do you think you could do to get out? In this instance, you're right. The cat has to trigger the appropriate lever, which will open the door, and the cat can get out and eat the food. So no matter what the cat does, it's doing things and it's noticing it can't leave. Eventually, when the cat learns what it needs to do to get out, push the lever, it's going to leave and get the food right away. If I put the cat back in the box, how long do you think it would take that cat to push the lever again? And you're right, it wouldn't take long at all. The cat would realize that the behavior that I want it to do is to push that lever and it's going to get out and get food, a reward for doing so. This graph, which depicts time to escape on the x-axis, and then we have, the y-axis, and we have trials on the x-axis. Thorndike's cats display trial and error behavior when trying to escape from the puzzle box. Imagine the first time you put the cat in the box. What's it going to do to try to get out? It might struggle. It might make some mistakes. So they're going to make a lot of irrelevant movements and actions until eventually they figure out what is the solution to get out of there. So you can see the first, I don't know, 10, 20 trials, it's taking some time to figure out, what do I need to do to get out? But once it knows what to do, from trials really 25 to 70, it takes very little time to escape the box. So again, we're talking less than a minute to get out of there. The role of reinforcement and punishment. Now, I should warn you, punishment is not what you think it is, but we'll explain that in a moment. Operant conditioning or operant behavior is a behavior that an organism produces that has some impact on the environment. This term was coined by B.F. Skinner. He demonstrated it using a conditioned chamber or Skinner box. A Skinner box could contain levers that rats could press to get food. It could contain a screen that pigeons could peck, that if they did, could get food. You're basically trying to create something that they can do that they naturally produce. Typically in the environment, like rats will push things, birds will peck, in order to do something very specific to get a reinforcer, which is food. A reinforcer then is any stimulus or event that functions to increase the likelihood of behavior that will lead to it. So imagine I put a rat inside of a Skinner box and I want it to push a lever. The first time I put it in the box, the rat's not going to know what to do. So how would I train that rat to do what I want? Now, if you've ever trained your pet at home, you probably have an idea of what we're going to do. At first, we're going to feed or reward the rat with food from what's called a hopper, but we're going to reward them when they get closer to the wall where the levers are. So we might start with very slowly reinforcing, I want you to come over here. And eventually they'll learn, hey, I'm getting food if I go over there. And then we will stop that when we'll see extinction occur. No, no, it's not just coming over to the wall. Now I need you to get up near this lever on the wall. And then we try to encourage them to get over to the lever. And eventually they'll be curious and stand up. And if they touch the lever, that's where you give them food. And they'll learn pretty quickly to continue the behavior in order to get the reward. So the reinforcer can be a positive reinforcement, and it can also be negative. A punisher is any stimulus or event that functions to decrease the likelihood of the behavior that led to it. So the punisher is to stop the behavior that's undesirable. It's not physical punishment. I need to make sure that's clear. So the punisher is, I want the behavior to stop. And in a second, we'll go through an example of a positive punishment and negative punishment. But we want the behavior to change, not to continue. Think about yourselves or your siblings, or maybe peers in a class where they started acting out. If they start acting out like the class clown, you're all laughing. So you're reinforcing that behavior, which means they're more likely to do it. But how does your teacher feel when you see them acting out? Well, they're going to try to figure, how do I punish them? And the punishment has to be taking something away. It's not a physical thing. So the reinforcement, we're really thinking about biological needs. So those are primary reinforcers, food, drink. Secondary reinforcers are often associated with the primary reinforcers. We'll also see over-justification effect, where are circumstances when external rewards can undermine the intrinsic satisfaction of performing a job or performing a behavior. This is an example of what a Skinner box would look like. You can see how they'd be placed inside the chamber. We would then close that door. You can see right now it's actually standing up and pushing on the lever. So above that lever, you can see there's what looks like a light. That's exactly what it is. This is where flashes of light could occur, or we could have a bird's peck just above the lever. There's lots of things. Well, not lots, but there's different things we could use the lever versus the light for pecking or for touching with a rat in order to learn some kind of behavior. When it comes to reinforcement and punishment, it's easier to think about this in the example that's provided for us by the authors. So, if a stimulus is presented, so positive reinforcement, the goal is to increase the likelihood of behavior. If you're behaving really well, imagine if your parents bought you a car as a reward for safe driving. You've been such a good, you know, driver. Here's a new car. I can also increase the likelihood of behavior by removing the stimulus. The negative reinforcement, so positive reinforcement is great job. Here's a new car for your safe behavior. A negative reinforcement is I'm going to remove something negative. And this is where the parents reduce the restrictions on where you can drive as a reward for safe driving. So imagine you first got your license. Your parents might say, which is also the law, you can't be out after hours. But imagine now you have your full license. You're still relatively new and inexperienced. Imagine your parents said, you know what? You've been driving so well that the positive reinforcement is here's your car for your great behavior, but there's also restrictions on where you can go with it. Eventually, they might remove those, which is your negative reinforcement being removed, meaning, hey, you can take that car wherever you want to go. Have fun, be safe. But let's just say you do something that is undesirable. You get caught speeding. Now, the punishment in this case would be to, you know what? Because you were caught speeding, you have to go and do these chores for me. I'm going to give you a bunch of difficult chores. And you're supposed to associate, "No, I don't like doing all these chores, but I have to do it because I was caught speeding." Negative punishment. So positive punishment is we're adding things. So stimuli is added. Here's the car. Yay. Here are the chores. That it's the negative. You don't want to do things. The removing of a stimulus, like a negative reinforcement, is removing the restrictions, but a negative punishment, so the stimulus removing things, is I'm going to suspend your driving privileges. This is where negative punishment is you're grounded because you got caught sneaking out at night. The goal is you would not do that again in the future. So remember, these are just situations where we're trying to increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring. The role of reinforcement and punishment. What's the purpose of this in the grand scheme of learning? Primary and secondary reinforcers really satisfied the primary reinforcers, satisfy biological needs. This is where we provide our kids with food, comfort when they're not feeling well, shelter, warm place, roof over your head to live. But there's also secondary reinforcers. And think of how important these are to you through your learning journey. Verbal approval. Very good job. Imagine the sentence, I'm disappointed in you. Not so good, is it? But in this case, it's supposed to be the positive things because we're talking about reinforcement really more than punishment. So it's good job. Here's a participation trophy, money for doing things that are rewarding. What's really critical in the scheme of learning behavior is time. The immediate versus delayed reinforcement and punishment can have very different consequences on behavior. Let's, for example, say you get a new pet, a new puppy dog, like mine's here with me right now. And let's say Piper decides, she's going to have an accident on the floor. That's not desirable, and I don't want her to. So if she was going to have, an accident, be like, no, stop, let's go outside. And if we're going to go outside, I'm going to try to reinforce her with great job, good work. Treats are also really effective in this instance. But in the case of time, imagine I went to work and I came home and I found that Piper had an accident on the floor while I was at work. If I come in the door and see, oh no, Piper had an accident, what would you do? If you're thinking we should yell at the dog and say, bad girl, you shouldn't have, had an accident on the floor. What the dog has learned is when you come home and you're angry, the dog's not going to remember that, they had an accident on the floor. That could have happened 7 hours ago. The key trick in training is that we lose effectiveness as time passes. So we're trying to find an association between when something happens and whatever it is occurring. So whether we're reinforced for something positive and when we did it. So imagine you work really hard and you're expecting some compliments for whatever it is you've done. And imagine they don't come. People see you like, meh. But then later on, the next day, they're like, oh, yeah, good job. And you're like, good job on what? It's out of context. It's like it doesn't make sense. Now, imagine you're an animal where you can't really explain things as well. We have to rely on food as the reinforcer to be our drive to change behavior. So, delaying reinforcement almost renders it completely ineffective. That's why when you're training animals, you have to reinforce them right away. Like, good job, treat. Good job, treat. You don't delay. Because over time, as you can see here, the animal will stop pressing the lever altogether, especially if you have to wait 20, 40, 60 seconds to get a reward. It just doesn't work. It's like they don't know what you want them to do. So you would want to avoid really complex training um, in the event that it'd be hard to acquire the task at hand. So the longer the delay between a behavior and the administration of punishment to stop behaviors, the undesirable behaviors from occurring, the less effective the punishment will be in suppressing the targeted behavior. It's often difficult to administer punishment immediately or even soon after a problem has occurred in everyday life. Think about when people do make bad decisions. If there's not a teacher or a parent or someone there to address this right away, these kinds of behaviors can persist. And I'm not trying to be overly judgmental, but the reality is sometimes people just make poor decisions consistently. And the trick to correct these would be to address the problem immediately and not let it go unresolved. So, how do we, and what are the strategies for increasing the effectiveness of delayed punishment? You'd have to increase the severity of the punishment. You're trying to really bridge a gap between the behavior and the punishment with verbal instructions as well. We know that learning takes place in many contexts, not just sort of the any situation possible. It's not completely anything or unlimited, but it's pretty much restricted to the common areas where we spend most of our time. Especially as a child, you can imagine where that is, school, versus you now as a young adult and where you spend most of your time. But we have to be able to discriminate where we are. Think about generalization or behaviors that are consistent. In any class you go to, you behave the same. Similarly to going to a movie theater or other areas where there's a congregation hanging out, you basically sit down and listen. We also now know that the context of things where you engage in is also really important. So most behavior is under stimulus control, and it develops when a particular response occurs only when an appropriate discriminative stimulus is present. So we'll be able to discriminate against different stimuli. We know that certain responses are appropriate in some contexts, but necessarily not in others. And we know that stimuli, through a discriminative stimulus, that it'll indicate a response that will be reinforced because we want behavior to occur. Like in this example, on the left, you can see Cubist artists like Picasso. And we could train participants to peck at Picasso's artwork or other artists similar to Picasso. Conversely, I could train participants to also discriminate between Monet and other French Impressionists if I wanted. The fact is, we have done studies like this, just that our participants were pigeons. So they're able to discriminate and learn to peck to particular art over others. So peck to Picasso, ignore Monet, or vice versa, and get reinforced with food. It's pretty incredible, like I said, what we're able to do with animals to get them to behave in a way that we want. Extinction continued. The more complicated and operant conditioning, this is more complicated in operant conditioning than classical conditioning because it really depends in part on how the reinforcement is received. Meaning, there are more than one ways to reinforce an animal for its behavior. And we're going to go through several of these in just a moment. But operant behavior undergoes extinction when the reinforcement stops, it doesn't occur. This is particularly useful. Not, I'm sure if you're thinking about this or not, but it came to mind just before I switched the slides there, is that imagine you experience something that makes you feel, let's say, mild anxiety, for argument's sake, or even if it was severe. How would you break that? So this is where extinction as a behavioral modification could work. You can imagine a scenario through behavioral therapy where it might be like, I want you to think of the thing that causes you discomfort. Just think about it. And I know that might be a daunting task, but over time of working with a mental health professional, you should be able to just think about the object that caused you initial distress. Then maybe we could look at a photograph of it. There it is. Now we know it's not real, but how does this image make you feel? And over time, you're trying to not just think about it, you're trying to look at it and realize that everything is okay. And I recognize the response to this may not be everything's okay. That's why we try to do this over time. Everything's okay. It might go from thinking about it, seeing a picture of it. Maybe we have a stuffed animal we can bring in or a stuffed thing. Here it is. Here's a stuffy. Can you touch it? Can we just bring it over closer to you? And every day it gets a little bit closer to the point where you're able to hold it. They do this with spiders. They would get you to think about them. Then here's a picture of one. Here's a real one in the room. And we're going to gradually work up to can you hold it? Over time, you'll see a marked change in behavior or a physiological response to things like spiders, other fears and phobias that we have, to the point where we should be able to suppress the behavior, that response, so that you feel okay. And it doesn't mean it won't spontaneously recover, that maybe you'll relapse. You see now how human behavior is complicated, and these kinds of techniques can help modify behavior to think it's more desirable, maybe more typical, which replaces what we used to say as normal. But what's important in learning is thinking about reinforcement. What kinds of schedules of reinforcement exist? We'll talk about organisms responding in patterns, which reinforcement can appear. And these patterns, we know rats will press a lever, for example. Do you think the rate of pressing would change if the interval between the time was the differenting or the different factor of reinforcement? What about different ratios of different amounts of times you have to push the lever to get food? So interval schedules and fixed, let's just basically go right to the images here. If I'm going to reinforce you on a fixed ratio schedule, okay? So the ratio is about the number of presses. And if it's fixed, meaning every 10 presses you get food, what you're going to see is they're going to press rapidly to get to 10. They might go slowly one, two, three, but then they're going to go four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10, and then they get food. And when they learn that it's the 10th response, you'll get the stepwise function. They'll just hammer the presses to get the food, and then they'll do it again and again, and they learn basically that every 10 presses mean I get food. Imagine you're gambling. This is probably a good way to think about this because this research actually does inform how you can program slot machines. Imagine it was fixed ratio, just the number of presses on the button, that's what rewarded you. If you figured that out, you could then change how you bet to win really big when you know the next trial is the winning trial. Variable ratio is similar, but a little bit different than the fixed in that it's just different amounts of presses that are random. So in this instance, variable ratio schedules with slot machine would make more sense because now it's unpredictable. You can't track the presses. We just know that you press, you get rewarded. What if it was over time? So the reason that the variable ratio is longer to acquire than fixed ratio is that we're really quick to learn the number of things we need to do to get a reward. Sometimes if we don't know what to do and it's random, it's harder to really associate the reward with the behavior we're doing. Meaning you can't quite figure out how many presses I need. It's random or variable. The fixed interval is that it's over time. It doesn't matter how many times you press the lever, it only matters that you press it once a minute, meaning you're only going to be rewarded for pressing it once every minute. If you would like to press it 60 times in a minute, you're still only going to get fed once. And what these animals in these instances will do is that it's not about the culmination of pressing the lever. It's about just being patient and waiting. And they will learn this and they will start pressing closer to the time that they know they're going to get fed. So basically, they press, they get food. And over time of learning to press, nothing happens. They press again, get food. Once they learn it's once a minute, you'll see just around that sort of 55 seconds or so, they'll start hammering the lever, anticipating it's about to come. And then, whoop, there it is. There's the food. They eat, then they wait, and then continue. Variable interval is really challenging in acquiring a task because it there's no link between the amount of time passing and when you're going to get fed. Meaning, you can press the lever, you might get food. You may press it again, nothing happens. You might press it and you might get food again. But that interval of time that needs to pass is random, which makes the acquisition much more difficult than the other conditions. So effectively, that's fixed ratio schedules, variable ratio schedules, and then things like intermittent reinforcement is when only some of the responses made are followed by reinforcement. It can produce slightly higher rates of responding, and responses are more resistant to extinction in this instance. When we're learning behavior or we're training an animal to do something, really what we're doing is shaping it. This is learning that results from the reinforcement of successive steps to a final desired behavior through successive approximation. Sometimes, though, when you're training, especially animals, you'll get results of them doing things that you didn't intend them to do. I remember watching a video when I was an undergraduate where the bird just had to peck the screen to get food initially. And remember, I told you how you would put a rat in a cage, and if it got closer to the front of the where the hopper was, they would just start giving it food to say, "This is desirable what you're doing. I want you to do more of this." In one instance, the bird was on a perch, and it flew over to another perch by the screen. It pecked on the flash of light where it was supposed to, but then it flew back to its perch that was behind where the area to peck was, and the food came, so it flew back. But the bird ended up flying a loop pattern because it got reinforced, thinking that it had to fly back to the second perch to get the food when it actually didn't. It just had to stay where it was. The problem is we can't use language to tell the bird, no, 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 you're doing something you don't need to do, but it had learned to do it. So now every single time it was going to go over and peck at the screen, it would fly over, peck, fly back to the perch, and then get rewarded for food. It was hilarious, but again, that's the challenge of sometimes odd behaviors occurring, is that really we think something else is explaining why things are occurring. Now, think about what superstitious things you might do when you're preparing for a test. Think what athletes do. Oh, I had such a great game. I'm going to wear the same socks and jock shorts that I wore yesterday. Your behavior has nothing to do with your socks. It has nothing to do with anything else you wore, that you ate. Even think of the World Series that just occurred between the Dodgers and the Blue Jays. You had one of the Blue Jays players sleeping on the couch of their teammate. And sleeping on the couch had nothing to do with the fact that you had a good game the next day, but I can see why you're trying to not do things any different. Your odd behavior really doesn't lead to your performance, but it's mistakenly thought to be the case. In this instance here, Skinner was trying to shape a dog by going over to the wall, and the higher up it got on the wall to the lines, the better the reward it would get. And he thought this was a pretty cool party trick. And then the dog went over, stood up, as you see in the bottom right corner, to the wall, and then jumped. So that was the highest it could jump. So through the successive training, Skinner taught Agnes this cool little party trick and was able to get her to jump straight to the top line to get reinforced. So we've kind of gone through really important contributions to learning so far. It's classical conditioning with Pavlov, and we're trying to condition natural behavior to, let's just say unnatural at this point, stimulate to elicit a new response. Operant conditioning was really more about shaping behavior to desirable outcomes. But, and while behaviorism is becoming tremendously popular, and it's still pretty sophisticated, it becomes a little simplistic and it overlooks other elements that can explain why the behavior occurs. Enter Edward Tolman. Tolman saw operant conditioning as a means end relationship because a lot of the prevailing ideas at the time were we think about the world as stimulus and response decisions, meaning if we want to go outside, the stimulus is the door, the response is to open the door, and then we would close the door and we'd continue on our way. But if I said close your eyes and walk out the door, you can just mentally get up and move around the room, open the door, and leave. They weren't taking into the account the cognitive influences that affect learning. Holman will work with latent learning, conditions in which something is learned but is not manifested as a behavioral change until sometime in the future. As a consequence of his latent learning, he's arguing that rats are developing a cognitive map. They're creating a mental representation of the physical features of the environment. So here you can see, imagine with latent learning. So learning is about later in time. The control group is going to learn a maze, and the rats don't mind learning mazes, but we're going to count the number of errors that they make. And we're just going to record the number of errors they make over time. In this case, 17 days. The control group never gets food, so they're never rewarded for solving the maze. You can see that over time, they get a little bit better, making around 7 errors from 10, but they really never get better than 6. There's no motivation or incentive to be better, if you will. But look at this orange line. This is the group that was not rewarded like the control group, meaning they're treated exactly the same. And it's not surprising to see the number of errors they make up into day 11 is exactly the same. But then on day 12, they're given a reward at the end of the maze. And look how quickly their behavior changed. When they get food, the number of errors from day 11 to 12 decreased from 6 to 2. And then from there on, they're making under 2 errors on average to complete the maze. That's the importance of food, if you will, as a motivator to learn to complete the maze. But what happens if you're fed every day? Look at the blue line. This is where the reward was at the end of the maze every day. And over time, you can see there's learning. In fact, before day 11, they are making fewer errors. But look what happened afterwards. They still continually made more errors than the other group. Now, latent learning and the reason that cognitive maps becomes argued as relevant for these rats is that Pullman taught his rats using to solve the maze in a very simple way. So in preliminary training in A, you can see basically there's only one way to go. There's the circle, go in, and that the food is off to the right in space, but to get there, they had to go through a tunnel, turn left, turn right, and then turn right and enter the chamber to get the food. When they were tested, what they do is they block off the preliminary training tunnel, as you can see here. So it's blocked off. Now, the rat could have gone through the tunnels on the left, but if you think about the training, it never did go left. It always went straight and then eventually made some turns, like left and right to get the food. But the rats learn really quickly. You know what? The food is over here in space. Let's say down aisle 5. And the rats were able to complete this without making errors. The problem in doing that was behaviorism couldn't explain it. If it was see a stimulus and make a response, they shouldn't be able to complete this task as the way that they did. And in fact, in one instance, I remember reported in Tolman's Cognitive Mice and Rats and Men in 1948 that one of the rats climbed out of the maze and just went over and got the food. And there's no way a stimulus response, which is the prevailing hypothesis of behaviorism, could explain a rat to solve these mazes. It just couldn't. They were so complicated in design that really this was a beautiful result, demonstrating that these rats have a cognitive representation of where the food is in space and completed it effortlessly. I think I will pause the lecture here. That's a good place. There's about 30 slides remaining, but I appreciate you listening and bearing with me so far. I hope this is making sense. And we will continue with part 2 shortly. Until then, thank you and speak soon.